I happen to believe that global warming is real. I think I have a constituent breakfast every Wednesday. We're changing it to Thursday morning, and I go through this, and I'm surprised how many people don't know that the atmosphere around the Earth is limited, and that when you put fossil fuels and carbon dioxide or methane or other things into that atmosphere, they don't dissipate. They warm the atmosphere. And we've had a degree of change in the last century, ever since the Industrial Revolution. And so the temperature of the Earth is warming. And I look up at a map at the Arctic, and you see for the first time in history the Northwest Passage open year-round. Mm-hmm. You see the oceans beginning to rise. You see the weather changing, which is a product, too, of global warming. More tornadoes, more heavy hurricanes, raindrops bigger. And you know that if we do nothing in the next 100 years, the Earth will warm 4 to 7 degrees. It's catastrophic if that happens. And people believe that the Earth is immutable, that it doesn't change. And I say, go back 250 million years and look at the fact that the likelihood is that there were just a single landmass, and that landmass all split apart based on earthquakes, based on volcanoes, that the Earth can change, and we can destroy the Earth unless we're sensitive to these changes. So there is no question in my mind that we need to pay attention. And the way we need to pay attention is the development of alternatives to fossil fuels. And that can be done. And just the other day, the governor signed legislation coming out of the legislature, which requires a 33% renewable standard for California energy. That's positive. And we have led the way. And California will have a cap-and-trade system. And I think the United States can well learn from that system.
Our question from the audience asks, are California climate policies putting other state-funded programs at risk by driving industries out of state that produce jobs and tax revenues? California's been leading. Is it hurting the economy?
I actually don't believe that. I think that energy is the largest source of new jobs for this state. The estimate is that it can produce 100,000 additional jobs. And, whether it's solar or wind or biofuels, a lot of experimentation is going on at the University of California at the labs to come up with additional fuels. I went over to see the old Toyota factory, which is now a Tesla factory, an all-electric automobile, which is very smart looking, and things are happening, and we have to support them and see that the programs are in place that enable solar and wind to really develop to be a substantial share of our energy production.
And one way some people think to do that is to make fossil fuels more expensive or have them actually reflect the true costs. The Bowles-Simpson plan calls for a 15-cent a gallon tax increase on gasoline. There's a group here in California that includes George Shultz and people from Chrysler and Volvo who want to raise the gasoline tax 1 penny a month over 10 years, very predictably and stably. Do you think that gasoline tax ought to be part of some mechanism for encouraging renewables and addressing climate change?
I'd go slow on that. We have very long commutes for workers in this state. And, if you're buying $5 a gallon gas for 20 gallons a tank, and you're driving 100 miles to work and 100 miles back from work, which people do, it's very expensive. And so I would go slow on that.
Slower than a penny a month?
Yeah, I would. I mean, we have a big gas tax. We have a federal gas tax and a state gas tax now. This is not the time when gasoline is as high, when the nation is trying to pull itself out of recession. We need to keep gasoline below the $4 mark right now.
And you think that it's happening because of speculation, not because of demand from China or other things?
No, I do. I do, because supply is down. I mean, demand is down, and supply is even. So what can it be? The futures market, maybe?
Some people think that was what behind the spike in 2008, which was the last time we saw gas prices this high. Another energy issue that you've been engaged in recently is nuclear energy. The disaster in Japan has raised new questions about nuclear programs in the United States and elsewhere. And recently you wrote a letter to the Nuclear Regulatory Commission that they should consider newly discovered fault lines before granting license extensions for operating nuclear plants. Most of the U.S. nuclear plants are near the ocean. Several of them, like Diablo Canyon in California, are near earthquake faults. How do you think that we should respond on the nuclear front after Japan?
Well, we have 104 nuclear plants in this country, 2 in California. About 23, I think, have the same nuclear system as the Daiichi system. And I think there should be deep concern over what happened in Japan. It's a big learning lesson. I visited now the 2 nuclear plants, both Diablo, run by PG&E, and San Onofre, run by Southern California Edison. And what I found there was staff very much concerned about safety. Really good staff, 1,100 staff at Diablo and 3,000 staff at San Onofre, each one producing about the same amount of megawatts. However, what we have is a lack of attention to the whole fuel cycle, and particularly the spent fuel cycle. Hot rods are put in pools where they remain for up to 24 years now in our state. They should remain there for 5 to 7 years. Then they can be transferred to what are called dry casks, which are like cylinders that are made to survive. They were made as transfer products for the fuel rods to be put in and transferred into permanent nuclear storage somewhere. That was going to be Yucca Mountain. Yucca Mountain is no more. I believe very strongly that we need either regional or centralized nuclear fuel storage. I think it's asking for trouble to keep hot rods in spent pools for decades and dry casks right on the site of nuclear reactors. I think they should be moved away.
How about the number of plants we have and their quake safety? Some of these plants are coming up, and do you believe that they're fully ready for the kind of earthquake that we hear in California know is likely going to happen? These plants were built 30, 40 years ago, to lower seismic standards.
Right. Well, California is what's called the Ring of Fire, and that Ring of Fire goes around the Pacific. And we've seen Banda Aceh, and we have seen the quake in New Zealand, and we have seen the quake in Chile, big quakes, and the big quake with the huge tsunami in Japan. The United States Geological Service says the likelihood of that kind of quake in California is remote, that probably we would not have a quake over 8, and that may be stretching it. I'm not sure I believe that, because I'm not sure anybody's really in a position to know what Mother Nature will do.
Japan didn't expect the quake they got.
Right. So I think we've got to take a very good look, and I'm dedicated to it. I chair the subcommittee that provides the funds for the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, and I'm going to try to push as far and as fast as I can push to see that we really take a good look, a real examination at all facilities. What they're finding in Japan now is that corners were cut and things were not done that should have been done in order to save costs. And we can't afford that with nuclear energy.
Jeff Byron is a former member of the California Energy Commission, And he said the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is a captive agency. It's been captive by the industry. The industry pays for the NRC, and it's been a rubber stamp. Is that fair?
I don't really see that, to be candid with you. It is true, just as the FERC agency is paid for by
the Federal Energy
the Regulatory Commission is paid for by power plants, essentially.
Right.
This is the same situation. I had the chairman before my subcommittee, and he was, I thought, very direct, very forthright. He has followed up on everything I have asked him to do. I differ with him because he has said that these plutonium rods, hot, can remain in the spent fuel pools for up to 100 years. I just see no evidence that one can come to that conclusion, because these, in a big earthquake, it looks like the spent fuel pools, some of them ruptured in Japan. And I think we don't know for sure, but that's what it looks like. And that the fuel has leached and the hydrogen explosions came from that. So we need to be very careful and see and really know what we are doing.
And once we decide, there's going to be the question of cost. Who's going to pay for this? And utilities will have a choice of either trying to get the ratepayers to pay for it or their shareholders to pay for it if they're investor-owned utilities. Do you have any thoughts on who's going to bear the cost of shoring up America's nuclear power plants from the lessons learned from Japan?
Well, to get a nuclear permit takes a long time. So it's not the fastest game in town by a long shot. And I think now there's going to be a real look at the industry, a look at the containment zones, a look at the reactor, a look at the dry casks, a look at the spent fuel pools. And until that's completed, I don't really think we're going to face the question of new nuclear power plants.
One of the areas where we are building new power plants is in the area where there's desert, where there's lots of sunshine. And you've been an advocate for the Desert Protection Act, which you championed in 1994 and want to expand now. And that has caused some environmentalists and people who want to build large solar plants in the desert to say some interesting intra-family feuds among people who are usually on the same side. So how do you think we can build new solar while protect the environment in the desert?
Well, let me tell you what happened. I remember the desert when you drive along Route 66 or Highway 40, and what you would see are old mattresses and car hooks and, excuse me, it was kind of a disaster. You don't see that anymore. The desert is wonderful. It's not like the Sahara. We have flora and fauna and desert tortoises and bighorn sheep and Indian petroglyphs. And so I decided that we were going to try to see that the best parts of it were saved. We created Joshua Tree National Park, Death Valley National Park, and the Mojave Preserve. South directly of the preserve, in order to protect it, we began to buy some inholdings from a private company that had them. And one gentleman gave $30 million to this.
Inholdings being land inside?
Being land, about 600,000 acres total to preserve and conserve. And so one gentleman gave the $30 million, and I think we raised from the federal government $18 million, and we bought this land with the understanding that it would be in conservation. Well, one day, somebody comes into my office and said, "Did you know that there are all these solar plants planned for the areas that have been purchased for conservation?" And I said, "You've got to be kidding." And so I trot down there and meet with a number of the CEOs, and I see what they were intending to do. I see an 8 by 8 mile beautiful valley that was all going to be dug out with gravel, with a solar plant, 15 square miles, and it went on like that. So we put together a monument that would just protect the most pristine areas that have been undisturbed of this land. There is plenty of land in the desert that is disturbed, that can be used, and I think all of these companies are essentially finding other places to build now where there is no real environmental challenge to things that are endangered, like desert tortoises.
Land that's already impacted. I think they're deep. Land
Exactly.
that already has some human activity.
Exactly. We call it disturbed land and private land.
Then there's the question of distribution. I mean, getting the energy from where it's generated to the
That's
demand
right.
centers where the people are often involves going across somebody's ranch land, somebody's valued ecosystem, and there's some real messy fights there about people who are progressive saying we need renewable energy, and yes, we might need to go across some places that are pretty.
Well, the transmission lines are another story, and there are transmission lines which come through there, at least 2 big ones. And
You can live with those?
so I think, oh yeah, yes, they're there, and I think we can live with them.
Can you live with new ones?
Well, it depends on where they go.
Water is another big issue related to solar thermal, and you're, I believe, chair of the Senate Appropriations Subcommittee on Energy and Water. We have abundant water supply this year in California, but projections in climate change, as you mentioned, are for less water, more stress, more water fights. We're in a tight financial situation. How are we going to handle allocating water, less water in the future when we don't have money to build new conveyance or new storage?
Yeah, here's the big thing. When the infrastructure was built, we were about 16 million people. We are now close to 38 million people, and we have essentially the same water infrastructure. One big federal project and one state project, which was begun by Governor Pat Brown. We should be able to hold water from the wet years. We ought to be able to collect this year's runoff and hold it at ground storage for the dry years. We need to do more of this.
Sorry, at ground, is that meaning above ground or underground?
Well, it's both.
Okay.
We need to recharge the groundwater, which is very depleted, particularly in the southern part of the Central Valley, and can have a real problem with subsidence. We need to also increase storage. The legislature had looked at a bond which should go on the ballot, and
Keeps getting pushed back.
it keeps getting pushed back, and I hope very much this year that a bond issue will go on the ballot. We need to have an adequate water storage. We need to be able to do the recycling, the tertiary treatment, the groundwater recharge, transferring water back and forth based on need, and some of those things. And we need the money to do it.
One of the tensions is between fishermen and farmers, and you've sometimes favored sending water down south to farmers, and do you also think we need to sometimes bend the Endangered Species Act with regard to salmon and other species to kind of, as part of a water compromise?
Well, no, I've had a real problem with the science that the Department of Interior has used to determine when to shut down the pumps. That if you catch 7 smelt in the pumps, smelt are about this big.
Big as your finger, yeah.
You shut down the pumps. Well, did they count the number of smelt that were there in the first place? No. Did they count the smelt that were eaten by predator fish, which are all over the place? No. Did they count the smelt that might have died by the fact that sewage with ammonia is emitted into that area? No. And so my belief is that we are the largest agricultural state in the Union. I am very proud of California agriculture. I have tried to be helpful to it. We produce good produce. And it's a kind of, now that I live a lot on the East Coast, I know the difference. And trust me, California agriculture is really top-notch. So I want to see it be successful. And I think a judge has just thrown out the smelt opinion on the basis...
What an unfortunate name for a fish or a case, yeah.
On the basis of faulty biology. Now, the salmon opinion they are going to compromise rather than, I think, have the same fate. So we need to look at how we do these things more carefully. And I think that will be the case. We're lucky we've got a year where we have enough water. Everybody has 100% of their contract, except for south of Delta farmers, which right now have 85%. I think that will increase, but it is enough that they can fully plant.
Another question from the audience. BP said they would start drilling again. Do you think that BP should be allowed to drill in offshore oil drilling?
Well, I do believe that Interior is taking a very cautious role, and that the minerals and mining section of Interior has new leadership now, is expanding the inspectors, is much tougher on getting the equipment properly certified, that when Interior gives permission, it's got good grounds to do so.
So you're cautiously optimistic
Yes.
with the right management we can continue to
Yes.
drill. I believe the Western senators for the 3 Western states had introduced a bill together to ban offshore oil drilling in the Pacific. Is that
That's
still?
right. The people of California have spoken through initiative. They do not want oil drilling off the coast, and both Senator Boxer and I respect that, and we will fight anything that's going to put oil drilling off the coast of California.
Another energy question: is ethanol worth the fossil fuel energy required to produce it? You've also, I believe, spoken about ethanol subsidies.
Yes, I'm opposed to it. There's a trifecta of subsidies and that now exist. There's a 54-cent tariff on ethanol that can be imported cheaper. Corn ethanol is not the best thing, as we know, and there's a big subsidy for ethanol. You don't need to have these subsidies, and they cost billions of dollars a year. So in this respect, I agree with Senator Coburn, who also has a bill. We will come together and hopefully do away with the ethanol subsidies.